In this Duskmourn draft guide, I'll be providing you with all of the information you need to know before diving into your first draft. I'll be discussing the set mechanics, the top commons for each color. I'll provide archetype overviews for each color pair, discuss combat tricks to be aware of, traps to avoid, combos you can assemble, and more. Kicking things off with the set mechanics, they are Survival, Rooms, Eerie, Manifest Dread, and Delirium. Survival is a new mechanic found on creatures that is quite straightforward. If the creature is tapped at the beginning of your second main phase, you'll get a bonus. So in the case of Acrobatic Cheerleader, it'll get a flying counter. Next is Rooms, which is a new type of enchantment. You may cast either half of the room, and then when it comes into play, that particular half will unlock. And then as a sorcery, you can pay the mana cost of a locked door to unlock it. So in the case of Derelict Attic / Widow's Walk, you can play either half of the card. So let's just say you cast Derelict Attic. It'll come into play, Derelict Attic will unlock, and you'll get that effect. And then later on down the line, you can pay the Widow's Walk mana to get that effect as well. Next is Eerie, which is a mechanic that rewards you when an enchantment you control enters and whenever you fully unlock a room. And so in the case of Stalked Researcher, that lets a creature with Defender attack. So another pretty straightforward mechanic. Next is Manifest Dread, which is a mechanic that says look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one onto the battlefield face down as a 2/2 creature, and the other into your graveyard, and then you can turn the face down creature face up at any time by paying the mana cost that you would have used if you were casting it as a creature. So Bashful Beastie will manifest Dread when it dies, and so then you'll just have another 2/2 that you can potentially flip up. So it's a nice way to fill your graveyard, and also a nice way to have some subterfuge going on. Finally, there is Delirium, which is a mechanic that rewards you for having 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard. So card types like creatures, enchantments, lands, artifacts, instants, sorceries, that sort of thing. So if you have 4 or more card types, then you'll get an extra bonus when you cast your Delirium spells. Moving on to the top commons and kicking things off with white. At number 1 is Trapped in the Screen, a really nice removal spell for white to have access to. It can get rid of blockers, it can get rid of your opponent's big threats if they're attacking you. It can really do it all. It even can get rid of things that aren't creatures like enchantments and artifacts. So that's really nice as well. And if your opponent does happen to have enchantment removal, they're going to have to pay a premium because of that ward cost if they do want to get rid of Trapped in the Screen. So it's a really nice common. At number 2 is Unsettling Twins. 2 bodies for 1 card is really nice, especially because the Manifest Dread card can potentially flip up later into something that's bigger than just a 2/2, and also all of the other perks of having 2 bodies with 1 card, like helping you go wide, and also potentially filling up your graveyard for things that care about that with the Manifest Dread. So Unsettling Twins just fits nicely into a lot of different white strategies. And then at number 3 is Seized from Slumber. It's better in defensive decks where you're going to be casting the discounted version of it more often, but sometimes your aggressive deck is also going to be on the back foot when you play against other aggressive decks, and so you're still going to be able to benefit from that cost decrease. And also being able to kill something for 5 mana at instant speed is also quite solid on its own. It's not premium, but because of the discounted ability, the flexibility is really nice, and so Seized from Slumber is a card you'll want to be having in your white decks. Next up is blue. At number 1 is Tunnel Surveyor. This card is really nice. 2 bodies for 1 card, one of which is an enchantment, which will trigger some of your cards that care about enchantments coming into play, thanks to the Eerie mechanic and things like that. And Tunnel Surveyor 2/2 plus a 1/1 is just really nice for 3 mana, and one you'll be really happy to have in all of your blue strategies. At number 2 is Vanish from Sight. 4 mana, you get to deal with one of your opponent's threats. It's important to note that this isn't card disadvantage because the card goes back into your opponent's library. So even if they put it on top, they will have to redraw it. And then Surveilling 1 is really nice. It can fill your graveyard if you care about that, but it's also really good because in the mid game when you don't need lands, any land you can surveil away is basically like drawing a card, which is really good upside to have on an interaction spell. Then at number 3 is Unable to Scream. It's really, really efficient as a way to just deal with any pressure that's coming at you. So if you're playing a slow deck, Unable to Scream, 1 mana, you can answer a threat of almost any size and just be able to make it into an inconsequential thing that you'll maybe deal with down the road once you start attacking. But if you're playing a control deck, you don't really care about that. And also it does trigger the cards that care about enchantments coming into play, which is really nice. Next is black, and at number 1 is Murder. Very straightforward, 3 mana, destroy target creature. Double black can be a little bit tricky to enable sometimes, but you can often just wait until the late game to cast this card anyway, and so that's going to be totally fine in most cases, and 3 mana instant speed kill spells are just really nice. At number 2 is Fanatic of the Harrowing. This card is pretty small in terms of the stats, but the fact that it makes your opponent discard a card is nice, and it lets you discard a card as well to facilitate getting rid of extra lands, putting card types into your graveyard to enable Delirium, and maybe even enabling some value in terms of reanimation in the white-black strategy. So Fanatic of the Harrowing is just a nice little solid card. And then Baelmerk Leech is a 2-drop that can really do a lot of damage to your opponent thanks to its ability, because whenever enchantments come into play and when you unlock rooms, you're going to be dealing damage to your opponent, which means even if you're in a board stall, your opponent is still going to have to worry about the Baelmerk Leech dealing damage to them over the course of the game, which is really nice. Next is red. At number 1 is Scorching Dragonfire. 2 mana, deal 3 damage, is really good at instant speed, and exiling is especially relevant in this set because there are mechanics like Delirium that care about the graveyard. Next is Glassworks and Shattered Yard. It is a room card, so the primary mode is the 3 mana. It comes into play and deals 4 damage to target creature and opponent controls. So 3 mana, deal 4 damage at sorcery speed is pretty solid, and then the fact that you then have the upside of playing 5 mana and then just start pinging your opponent is really nice, especially for aggro decks that have maybe gotten stalled out because your opponent isn't going to be able to just sit there forever. You are going to be putting pressure on them with your Shattered Yard. And so the fact that you have both of these in one card is really, really nice. And then Hands That Feeds is a really good 2-drop for red decks because in the early turns, you just want to have a 2-drop that can attack and do things. And then in the mid game, once you have Delirium enabled, a 2 mana 4/2 Menace attacker is really, really nice and really punches above its weight class. See what I did there with the hand? It punches above its weight class. So definitely a card you're going to want in your red aggressive decks, especially if you have ways to enable Delirium. Finally, we have green. At number 1 is Spineseeker Centipede. 3 mana for a 2/1 is not the best stat line, but the fact that you get value when it comes into play by being able to search up a basic land into your hand is really, really nice. It lets you keep hitting land drops. It lets you fix mana for if you're trying to splash or do something of that nature. And overall, it's just a card that you're going to be happy to have, made even better by the fact that in the mid game to late game, when you have Delirium enabled, you get a 3/3 Vigilance creature because of that Delirium ability, which is going to be really nice because all of a sudden you have a pretty solid attacker and blocker in those cases. At number 2 is Monstrous Emergence, which is a really cool removal spell for green because it is avoiding some of the weaknesses that green removal spells have had in the past, because the choosing of the creature that's going to deal the damage or have the damage equal to its power dealt is done as part of the casting. So even if the creature gets removed in response, your Monstrous Emergence will still be able to deal that damage. So if you have a 3/3 in play and you use Monstrous Emergence, choosing that creature to deal 3 damage, even if your opponent kills the 3/3, you'll still get that damage, which is really cool and just nice removal for green. And then at number 3 is Manifest Dread. This card isn't flashy. In fact, it just says Manifest Dread, but the fact is that you're going to be really happy to have both a card that manifests Dread to just get that 2/2 and fuel some synergies that care about that in green, but also being able to put a sorcery into your graveyard and mill one other card thanks to the Manifest Dread putting another card into your graveyard means that you're getting like halfway to Delirium almost no matter what with just one card, which works well with a lot of the green decks that care about filling the graveyard. So Manifest Dread is a really good synergy piece for a lot of green decks. Moving to the color rankings, it's always worth noting that it's better to draft what's open than just forcing a color because it's good, but these are the rankings that I have here. Green at number 1, it's just so deep. There's so many good solid green cards that you're happy to play. Blue at number 2, once again, a very deep color and especially has a lot of good uncommons that you'll be happy playing. White at number 3, a little bit less deep in the commons department, but still has really good uncommons. Red, kind of the same exact story. The uncommons are generally quite good. The commons are solid or more niche. They don't always fit into every single deck. But they are still quite nice. And then black doesn't have any like crazy good commons. It doesn't have any like over the top uncommons either. Just a lot of solid cards and a really good supplemental color for a lot of decks. So definitely be happy drafting any of these colors, but this is just, if you're making a close pick, this can be used as a tiebreaker. Next up is the archetype overviews. Red-white is an aggressive deck with a minor theme of caring about having creatures that have power 2 or less. So Arabella Abandoned Doll is a really nice aggressive card if you can enable it to attack, because if you have a few creatures in play and Arabella can attack because you have a combat trick or a way to like push it through or things of that nature, then you can do a lot of damage with your 2-drop, but you do have to make sure that you enable the attacks by having combat tricks or removal or things like that. Irreverent Gremlin is a really nice card for this sort of deck as well. not only as a 2/2 menace for 2, but also because it lets you get rid of lands in the mid to late game when you don't need them, which is something that red-white can struggle with. And then Midnight Mayhem lets you make a bunch of bodies for 1 card. It can fuel any synergies you have with those smaller creatures, and also just having like a bunch of damage and maybe some lifelink even to swing a race out of nowhere can be really, really helpful. So that's the sort of strategy red-white is going for, a nice aggressive one. Next up is blue-black, which is an eerie control deck. Skull Snap Nuisance is a really nice 2-drop for this deck because not only is it a 2-mana 1/4 flyer, which is really hard to get through and can chip in for damage, but also lets you surveil to set up your draws going forward. Duskmourn's Domination is really good for this deck because it's a slow card being 6 mana, but it will not only serve as a 2-for-1 by being able to steal your opponent's creature, but also trigger your Eerie cards. So it's like extra value on top of extra value with Duskmourn's Domination, and you'll be trying to get to those late game situations where it can thrive. And then Fear of Infinity is a really good win condition for this deck. If you mill it over at some point, maybe you manifest Dread and you put this card into the graveyard and then put the other card face down, then Fear of Infinity is just in your graveyard for free, or if there's anything of that nature. But also just playing it, attacking, having it die, having a resilient win condition is really nice because your opponent is going to have to deal with this card. A 2/2 flyer with lifelink, even if it can't block, the lifelink kind of mitigates that, and it's just a nice card to have access to in your control deck as a finisher. Next is green-white, which is a deck that cares about survival. So Shrewd Storyteller is the perfect card for this deck because it's a 3-mana 3/3, so good stats. And then if it's tapped in your second main phase, then you can put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. And one of the keys with this deck is, of course, you can get your creatures tapped by attacking with them. And so your survival creatures are naturally going to be good if you're on the aggressive plan and able to attack. But even if you can't attack, you want to have a card like Coordinated Clobbering, which lets you tap your creatures and deal damage with them. And then you'll still get to trigger their survival mechanics, because the survival mechanic doesn't care about the creature having attacked. It just cares about it being tapped on your second main phase. Baseball Bat is similar, where it comes in, gives your creature a little bit of a buff, and enables attacks. But if your opponent doesn't have anything worth tapping, you can also tap one of your own creatures with Baseball Bat if it comes up. So keep that in mind. It just says tap up to 1 target creature. It doesn't have to be your opponent. So if you have maybe a survivor that can't attack, then, or because it's too small, the Baseball Bat can help you facilitate that. If you have, like, for example, like a flyer or something like that, that is attacking it and being able to trigger the Baseball Bat. So a nice aggressive strategy that cares about getting your creatures tapped, namely by attacking. Next is blue-red, which is a strategy that cares about rooms. It has access to Smoky Lounge / Misty Salon as a uncommon room that really is room-centric. Like, you only want this card in your deck if you have a lot of rooms, and you're going to be able to make use of the mana from Smoky Lounge, and Misty Salon is going to be making you a reasonably sized creature. Ghostly Keybearer is a really good card in this deck if you can enable it, because it can just get you a huge tempo swing by getting you a bunch of mana if you can unlock like an expensive part of a room, because there are a lot of rooms that you can play like a cheap half, and then there's an expensive half for later. And so if you have Ghostly Keybearer in play, you can play the cheap half and then just get a bunch of mana from the Ghostly Keybearer when it deals combat damage. And then finally, there's Intruding Soul Rager as a cool payoff for this deck, where once you've gone through a room completely and gotten all the value you want to get, you can sacrifice it to deal 2 damage to your opponent, but more importantly, draw cards to keep finding rooms and things of that nature. Next is green-black, which is a graveyard deck that cares about Delirium. Brood Spinner is perfect for this strategy because it's a 2-mana 2/3 reach, so it just shuts down opponent's attackers, and then it also has Surveil 2, so you can start filling your graveyard with the relevant creature types. And then in the very late game, you can sacrifice it for 6 mana to make a bunch of 1/1s based on the number of types of cards in your graveyard. So once you no longer need a 2/3, you can make some 1/1 flyers, which is cool. Drag to the Root is another good card for this deck, just an efficient removal spell that can deal with anything and gets even more efficient in the mid game once you have Delirium. And then Patchwork Beastie is a really cool 1-drop to play in this strategy, because even if it's not able to attack or block immediately, it's going to be milling you cards. It's going to be helping you enable Delirium. And if you happen to mill the Patchwork Beastie, it's an artifact and a creature, which is going to get you halfway there to Delirium all by itself by being 2 of the types that you care about. So just a nice graveyard Delirium strategy. Next is white-blue, which is a eerie tempo aggro deck. So you care about having cards like Gremlin Tamer, which is a 2-mana 2/2 that's going to make you extra gremlins whenever enchantments come into play or you're fully unlocking rooms, which is nice. Optimistic Scavenger is also a really nice card because you play this on turn 1, and then you're able to just put counters on like things whenever you're playing one of your enchantments, which you're going to have a lot of in this strategy. So it just grows your team and enables attacks. And then Inquisitive Glimmer is an enchantment creature, so it's going to trigger your cards and help you with other enchantments by making your enchantments cost less to cast and your rooms cost 1 less to unlock. So really a nice 2-drop to play in this deck because it'll help you curve out more efficiently. Next up is red-green, which is a Delirium aggro deck. So you want to be curving out and attacking your opponent, and then once you get Delirium enabled in the mid to late game, it'll help you cross the finish line. Wildfire Wickerfolk is perfect for this strategy because it's a 2-mana 3/2 haste that attacks really well in the early game and then gets +1/+1 and trample in the mid to late game, which is perfect for finishing the game off, especially if it comes out of nowhere because of the haste. It's also an artifact creature itself, so it'll get you halfway to Delirium if it does trade off in the early game because it is both an artifact and a creature, which is really nice. Fear of Burning Alive is a really nice top-end threat for this deck because the ability to deal 4 damage to your opponent is going to help finish them off, and by the time you get to 6 mana, you're oftentimes going to have that Delirium enabled, so that it'll be able to deal 4 damage to your opponent and one of the creatures that they control. And being an enchantment creature means that if it does get into your graveyard, maybe you manifest Dread and mill it, or have it as the face down creature and it trades off, then you all of a sudden have an enchantment creature in your graveyard, and that gets you halfway to Delirium as well by being an enchantment and a creature. Beastie Beatdown is a fantastic card for this deck. The ability to have a nice removal spell if you don't have Delirium, and then an absolutely fantastic one if you do have Delirium, all for just 2 mana, is really, really good. And Beastie Beatdown is a card you're going to be very happy to have in this red-green strategy. Next is white-black, which is a bit of a reanimator deck this time around. You have access to Rite of the Moth as a 4-mana way to bring a creature card from your graveyard back to the battlefield, and then you have flashback on this, so if you mill Rite of the Moth, or you just want to use it twice, then you have the ability to do that 2 different times. Shroud Stomper is the absolute perfect card to reanimate, so one of the ways you could get into your graveyard is Manifest Dread and you mill it over, or you Manifest Dread with it and have this be the 2/2 creature and then it trades off, or something of that nature, or you can discard it from your hand if you do draw it, or things of that nature. So if you get into your graveyard, then bringing it back is really good, and casting it for 7 is not the end of the world either, but if you bring this back for like 4 mana with Rite of the Moth on turn 4, then you're going to be just absolutely crushing your opponents a lot of the time. And then Live or Die is another way to have a reanimation spell, but also a removal spell for if you don't have a big creature in your graveyard, so that's a nice addition to this strategy as well. Next up is blue-green, which is a deck that cares about Manifest Dread. Growing Dread is the perfect card for this strategy because you'll play it on turn 2, and then any card that you turn face up will be a little bit bigger thanks to Growing Dread. Oblivious Bookworm is also stellar in this deck because a 2-mana 2/3 is already good, and then it just gets you a continuous stream of card advantage if you are able to keep manifesting Dread, and even the card selection without manifesting Dread is nice. And then Paranormal Analyst also provides you with a bunch of card advantage by turning all of your Manifest Dread creatures into essentially cantripping creatures, because the card that would have gone to the graveyard then goes to your hand, which is absolutely fantastic. Finally, we have Black-Red, which is a sacrifice deck. Thawblade Skinripper is the perfect card for this strategy as a 3-mana 3/2 menace that provides a sacrifice outlet and also lets you ping things down if you are sacrificing permanents on your turn. Disturbing Mirth is another good sacrifice card because it provides a sacrifice outlet temporarily when it comes into play, and then is also a really good card to sacrifice to your other sacrifice cards. So it almost plays both ends of the ball. If you are able to do that, then you get to get value on both sides. And then Diversion Specialist is a nice creature because it gives you a continuous sacrifice outlet that can provide you card advantage, which can then find you more things to sacrifice, and overall is a really nice addition, especially since it's a 4-mana 4/3 menace as well. Next up are the combat tricks at common. So these are the ones that you want to be most aware of. White has Jump Scare for 1 mana, which is going to give +2/+2 in terms of stats. Black has Give Into Violence, which is also going to give +2/+2 in terms of stats. Red has Turn Inside Out, which is going to give +3/+0 for the stats, but the creatures will still trade off because it doesn't give any toughness. Horrid Vigor is going to give Indestructible and Death Touch. And then Frantic Strength is one you're really going to want to be careful of because it gives +2/+2 and Trample, and it will stick around thanks to being an enchantment. So if they win the combat and keep Frantic Strength around, that's a big swing. Next are some traps to avoid. First is Erratic Apparition. 3 mana for a 1/3 just doesn't cut it these days. Flying and Vigilance are nice, so you'll chip in for some damage, and with the Eerie ability, sometimes you'll chip in for more than just 1 damage, but the problem is that it doesn't really block well enough for the 3 mana investment you're putting in, and in a world where there are survival creatures that care about surviving combat and being able to attack into things, a 1/3 doesn't threaten to block those well enough to be worth including in your deck. Next is Unwanted Remake, a card that looks really efficient as a kill spell, but generally because it's letting your opponent manifest Dread, it's not going to be worth it to kill your opponent's creatures with this because it's essentially 2-for-1ing yourself when you do that. If you want to play it as a fringe way to kill your own creatures in response to removal, that's up to you. But generally, I would advise against putting this card in your deck because it's just going to be too finicky to use it for that mode, and it's going to be disastrous to kill your opponent's creatures with it. Scrabbling Skullcrab is the final one I wanted to discuss because mill isn't really a supported archetype in this format. Unless you're milling your opponent out completely, it's generally just going to help them because it'll be filling their graveyard for delirium. So if you need an extra roadblock creature or an 0/3 for that purpose, or maybe you're going to mill yourself a couple of times to help you get delirium, then that's something you can use Scrabbling Skullcrab for. But if you're trying to mill your opponent out as a full strategy, that's not really supported in this format. Next are some combos that you can assemble with just commons and uncommons. First up is Say Its Name and Altenac the Thrice Called. It's built into the set. If you get an Altenac and then you play Say Its Name 3 times, then you get to just put Altenac into play from your deck or your graveyard or your hand, which is just a really nice thing to be able to do. It's a fun little combo that's already in the set. Next is the combo between Fear of Failed Tests and Enter the Enigma. Fear of Failed Tests is a 5-mana 2/7 that has a really nice ability if it hits the opponent, but a 2/7 is pretty easy to block. So Enter the Enigma comes in, makes it so it can't be blocked, and all of a sudden you're drawing a bunch of cards. Next is Ragged Playmate and Vicious Clown. Ragged Playmate can make it so creatures with power 2 or less can't be blocked this turn. Also a combo with Fear of Failed Tests that we just discussed. But with Vicious Clown, it's really cool because you can make it unblockable while it's just a 2/3, and then play another creature, or maybe even 2 creatures, and the Vicious Clown will remain unblockable because it got that status from the Ragged Playmate. And so that's a cool little way to push through a bunch of damage if you're in a board stall and you have both of those cards. And then the final combo is a classic, the Steal and the Sacrifice. You play Vengeful Possession, you take your opponent's creature, you hit them with it, and then you play Final Vengeance or any of the other sacrifice abilities and sacrifice that creature before you would give it back to your opponent, and get to take your opponent's creature, hit them with it, and then have it die because of your sacrifice effects. So a classic combo that you'll be trying to assemble in your black-red decks. Next is the mana fixing available at common. There is a cycle of 10 lands that are dual lands that will enter untapped if a player has 13 or less life. So that's you or your opponent. So keep an eye out for those. There is going to be a land slot in the packs that will have those some percentage of the time and basic lands some percentage of the time. There's also Terramorphic Expanse, which is a nice way to fix your mana in this set and also enable Delirium, because when Terramorphic Expanse is in your graveyard, it gets that land requirement for the Delirium. So that gets you 1/4 of the way to Delirium. Spineseeker Centipede we already discussed as a way to fix your mana. And then there is a room, Moldering Gym, that can let you get a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. And then it has Wait Room, so once you've ramped up, had a bunch of mana, you even get to Manifest Dread and put 3 counters on that creature. So that's a nice little payoff for getting a bunch of mana into play once you've used the Moldering Gym to fix your mana in the earlier turns. Final tips. Pay attention to face down creatures and try to deduce what they are and whether they are valuable. This is one of those things you'll pick up over the gameplay portion where your opponent will maybe seem hesitant to risk one of their face down creatures in combat. And so maybe if you have a removal spell that can kill something small, you'll use it to kill that creature instead of the one that they're just attacking with willy-nilly or things like that. You need to be aware of these things and focus in on it because you want to know which one your opponent is going to maybe flip up in the late game and have just like a big creature out of nowhere. And so if you can deal with that threat earlier in the game before it flips up, then that's going to be really valuable to you. And then the final tip is creatures with multiple card types are excellent at enabling Delirium. I've mentioned a couple of them as they've come up, but things like enchantment creatures and artifact creatures are really good for Delirium decks because they get you card types that are a little bit harder to get into the graveyard generally. Generally, creatures are a little easier. Instants and sorceries can be relatively straightforward, but enchantments and artifacts are a little bit harder just because they come up less in limited. So whenever you get enchantment creatures or artifact creatures, keep an eye out for those in your Delirium decks. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. Thanks so much for watching. If you made it to the end, leave hashtag DuskDrafter in the comments section down below. But I hope to see you on Duskmourn, and good luck in your drafts.